In this lesson, we're going to finish our simple application, and we're also going to take a look at the useEffect hook for the very first time. So in order to finish this, what I'd like us to do is actually return our dimension values to our UI so that we can cycle through them on click of this next button. So right now you can see if we console log our array, we've got all those string values in the console, but we just now need to return those to the screen on our web page. And we can do that first by creating an initial state, or creating state which is going to contain each of these values, and then we can use useEffect to actually update that. So first of all, I'm going to create a initial state called dim and set dim as the function, and set that useState to an empty array. And what we want to do is actually populate these array values into our initial dim state, and then we can just pick the relevant array using our index as we cycle through. So let's have a think about how we can populate this dim state with our full array of data. And we can do that by using the useEffect hook. So the useEffect hook is a React hook that accepts a function that is run after the render is committed to the screen. So the component is going to render, and then our useEffect hook will run, and then it will update this initial state from a blank array to the array of our dimension values. So by default, useEffect runs after every completed render, but you can choose to fire useEffect only when certain values have changed. So in this example, we're going to just fire useEffect after every single render of this component, and we'll look into different examples when we move on to our next more complicated project of where we might only want to render useEffect or run useEffect when only particular things are changing in our component. So we can do that by passing a second argument, which is an array of values that useEffect depends on. But as mentioned, we're not going to be looking at that in this lesson. We're just going to be rendering, we're just going to be running useEffect after every render of this component. So let's think about how we can push this array into this initial state. And we can do that by first just moving this into a function. So let's create a function called update dim. Oh. And I'm going to cut this out and just paste it in here. And this function is going to return the array. So the result of this function is going to be our array of values. And then we're going to want to call this. Now, we don't want to call this when the component is rendered, because we're actually setting our dim initially to an empty array. So what we're going to do is actually call this function after the render, and we can do that using useEffect. So let's import useEffect from React, and then we can use a hook, so useEffect, and then we're going to, as I said, it accepts a function, and then a second parameter is the arguments that this useEffect depends on to run. So an empty array here will mean that this function, whatever is placed inside this useEffect function, is run every single time the component is rendered. You can add dependencies if you only want this to run after certain things update. So in this example, we want this to run every single time, and we want to update our dim initial state with our full array of values. So we can set dim to actually this function. So we know that this function, when run, returns that full array. So let's think about the life cycle of our application. So the component is going to render, we're going to set our initial state, and then after that initial render, useEffect is going to run and it's going to update this state to our dimension array. So if we console log dim, and then we can refresh, you can see on initial render we have an empty array. So notice we have two dim and this component being rendered twice. So the initial render dim is actually an empty array because that's what we're setting in our initial state, and then on the re-render that state is updated to the full array of values. So that's exactly what we want and demonstrates quite nicely what we'd use useEffect for. So we're updating state just immediately after the component is rendered. And then we just need to grab that value and render that on the screen. So I'm going to remove these lines again, and we can add in another div. And we want to return our dim state. And we just don't want to return the full array, we just want to return one of those values depending on the button click, so we can pass index here into our array. So and initially we're going to be grabbing the dim 0, so the first element in our array, and then on click of this button we're going to cycle through our dimension values on each click. Okay, great, so that is our completed application. So it is nice and simple, but has introduced some key concepts in React. So we've looked at creating different components, we've looked at states, we've looked at useEffect, and we've also started using hypercubes for the first time. So in the next section, there's going to be a bit of a step up in terms of what we're going to be building, and we're going to be building our first mashup using React. So looking forward to it, and we'll pick this up in the next section.